She was sitting quietly in seat 12A, just another passenger on what was supposed to be a completely routine flight. Nothing about the moment suggested that it would become anything more. Her seat was by the window, the oval glass slightly fogged from the cool air outside, framing a pale blue sky stretched endlessly in every direction. She sat upright but relaxed, headphones resting loosely around her neck, hands folded in her lap. To anyone passing by, she looked ordinary, calm, detached, unremarkable. Just another traveler suspended between two cities, the cabin carried the familiar rhythm of commercial flight. The soft hum of the engines blended with the faint whistle of air rushing past the fuselage. Overhead vents whispered quietly, sending thin streams of cool air downward. The aisle lights glowed gently, not bright enough to disturb, not dim enough to cause concern. Rows of passengers were absorbed in their own worlds, some scrolling endlessly through their phones, thumbs moving out of habit more than purpose, others watching movies they would barely remember. Once the flight ended, a man of few rows ahead sipped coffee from a paper cup, grimacing slightly at the bitterness before returning to his laptop. A child across the aisle kicked their legs softly, sneakers brushing the seat back in front of them as a tired parent murmured reminders to sit still. Somewhere behind seat 12A, someone laughed quietly at something playing through their earbuds. Life in the cabin flowed forward in a gentle, predictable way. Flight attendants moved smoothly through the aisle, their steps practiced, their expressions calm and professional. A cart rattled softly as it rolled over the seams in the floor, the faint smell of reheated meals mixed with coffee and recycled air, an oddly comforting scent for frequent flyers. Everything felt controlled, measured, safe. Outside the window, clouds drifted lazily below the aircraft like thick white oceans frozen in motion. The sunlight reflected off their surfaces, bright but not blinding. From this height the world seemed distant and harmless. Problems felt small up here, tucked away far beneath layers of atmosphere and routine. Seatbelt signs were off. The plane was cruising steadily. This was the part of the flight where nothing happened. Then, without warning, the first jolt hit. It wasn't violent, just sharp enough to be noticed. A sudden dip, like a car hitting an unexpected pothole. A few heads lifted, fingers paused mid-scroll. Someone let out a short, surprised breath. The plane steadied itself again almost immediately, and the hum of conversation resumed, softer this time. Turbulence, people told themselves, normal, expected. But then came another jolt, stronger. The cabin trembled, not enough to throw anyone from their seat, but enough to rattle loose items. A tray table snapped shut somewhere. A phone slipped from someone's hand and landed on the floor with a dull thud. The aircraft shuddered, metal groaning faintly as if protesting the sudden movement. Seatbelt signs flickered on with a chime. Murmurs rippled through the cabin, a few nervous laughs followed, the kind people used to convince themselves they weren't afraid. The girl in seat 12A straightened slightly, her gaze shifting from the window to the aisle, then back again. Her expression didn't change much, but her attention sharpened. The turbulence didn't stop, instead it escalated. The plane dropped suddenly, not enough to scream, but enough to steal breath from lungs. Drinks sloshed dangerously close to the rims of cups. Overhead bins creaked, and something inside one of them shifted loudly. A flight attendant gripping the back of a seat paused, her smile fading for just a fraction of a second before she continued forward. Outside, the clouds no longer looked soft. They rose higher now, darker, thicker, swallowing the horizon. The sunlight dimmed as the aircraft pushed into their mass. The window beside seat 12, a turned gray, then almost silver, streaked with moisture and shadow. Another violent shake hit. This one made the cabin gasp as a single body. Someone cursed under their breath. Someone else whispered a prayer. A baby began to cry, startled by the sudden chaos. The plane pitched slightly to one side, then corrected itself, the wings flexing visibly through the window. The calm was gone. The sound of the engines changed, subtle but wrong, louder, strained. The steady rhythm that had been comforting moments ago now carried an edge of urgency. The floor vibrated underfoot, not smoothly, but unevenly. The girl in seat 12A noticed everything. She felt the timing of the jolts, the way the plane hesitated between movements, the unnatural lag before it stabilized. Her fingers tightened against the armrest, not in fear, but in focus. Her eyes tracked the wing, the clouds, the way the nose seemed to fight the air. Around her, panic began to surface. Passengers fumbled with seatbelts, the clicking sounds echoing through the cabin. Conversations stopped altogether, replaced by silence punctuated only by the roar of turbulence and the crying child. A man clutched his armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Someone else pressed their forehead against the seat in front of them, eyes closed. The aircraft lurched again, harder this time. A sharp downward drop sent stomachs floating. Screams erupted, brief but unmistakable. Oxygen masks didn't fall, but people looked up instinctively, half expecting them to. The plane shook violently, as if caught in the grip of something invisible and unforgiving. Then came the announcement. The familiar chime sounded, but there was nothing reassuring about it now. It cut through the chaos, commanding attention. The captain's voice followed, but it wasn't the confident, steady-tone passengers were used to hearing. It was tense. Ladies and gentlemen, the voice began, then paused, just for a second too long. Static crackled faintly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Another pause. The plane jolted again mid-sentence, and the sound of breath being pulled sharply into a microphone was audible. We are experiencing, the voice continued carefully, unexpected conditions. That was all it took. Fear spread instantly. Passengers exchanged looks filled with questions no one could answer. A woman whispered, "What does that mean?" to no one in particular. A man reached for his partner's hand, gripping it tightly. The child's crying grew louder, sharper, fueled now by the anxiety of the adults around them. The announcement ended abruptly, no reassurance, no timeline, just silence. The intercom clicked off. The turbulence continued, relentless and unpredictable. The cabin lights flickered once, briefly, before stabilizing. Somewhere, a flight attendant spoke urgently into a phone, her back turned to the passengers. Seat 12A no longer felt like just a seat. The girl sat very still, her gaze fixed forward now, her breathing slow and controlled. She wasn't panicking, but she wasn't relaxed either. Her mind was already working, measuring, analyzing the way the plane moved, the sound of the engines. The incomplete announcement. Something was wrong, not just turbulence, not just weather. The plane dipped again, more sharply than before, and this time there was no immediate correction. For a long, terrifying second, it felt as if the aircraft was falling freely through the sky. Screams filled the cabin. Then the plane leveled out barely. The relief was temporary, fragile. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, thick with fear and anticipation. People no longer looked at their screens. No one sipped drinks. Every eye was alert, every muscle tense, waiting for the next jolt, the next announcement, the next sign that things might get worse. Seat 12A remained silent. The girl didn't move, but everything about her attention had shifted. This was no longer just a flight. It was a situation unfolding, second by second, and instinct told her that whatever came next would demand more than passive fear. Something was seriously wrong, and the sky was no longer forgiving. As panic spread through the cabin, it did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, seeping into the spaces between breaths, tightening chests before people even realized they were afraid. The turbulence had not eased. If anything, it had grown more erratic, short, violent drops, followed by uneasy stretches of unstable calm. The aircraft felt less like a machine cutting cleanly through the sky, and more like something struggling against it. Passengers shifted in their seats, eyes darting from one face to another, silently searching for reassurance and finding none. The child who had been crying earlier was now screaming, sharp and uncontrollable. A man across the aisle whispered something urgently into his phone, ignoring the rule about airplane mode. A woman pressed both hands against her mouth, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if expecting oxygen masks to fall at any second. The girl in seat 12A had remained still until now. She had been listening not just to the sounds of the cabin, but to the aircraft itself. The pitch of the engines, the uneven rhythm of turbulence, the way the plane hesitated before correcting its altitude. Every signal told the same story. This was no longer a situation that could be ignored. Another violent jolt hit. The plane lurched sideways, sharp enough to throw a few passengers against their seatbelts. A scream tore through the cabin, followed by several more. Overhead bins rattled violently, and one snapped open, spilling a jacket into the aisle. The lights flickered again, this time long enough to make people gasp. That was when she stood up. The movement was simple, but it cut through the chaos like a blade. While others were frozen in fear or gripping their seats, she rose steadily from seat 12A, bracing herself against the sudden motion of the aircraft. Her posture was balanced, controlled, as if she had already adjusted her body to the plane's instability. Several passengers noticed immediately. "Sit down," someone shouted instinctively. A flight attendant farther down the aisle turned sharply, her face tight with alarm. "Ma'am, please." But the girl didn't panic. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She waited for the plane to stabilize for half a second, then stepped carefully into the aisle, one hand resting lightly on a seatback for balance. Her eyes were focused, not wide with fear, not darting wildly, but locked with intent on the cabin crew ahead. Another shake ran through the aircraft. She adjusted without thinking. That alone drew attention. The nearest flight attendant hurried toward her, gripping the tops of seats to stay upright. "Miss, you need to return to your seat immediately. This is not safe." "I understand," the girl replied. Her voice was calm, not loud, not defiant, just calm. The flight attendant hesitated, caught off guard not by the words, but by the tone. Panic was contagious in situations like this, and the crew had been trained to manage it. But the girl in front of her wasn't panicking at all. "There's a serious problem," the flight attendant said, her voice firm but strained. "Please, I know," the girl interrupted gently. "That's why I need to speak to the cockpit now." The words landed heavily. A man nearby scoffed nervously. "Everyone thinks they're an expert when things go wrong," he muttered. The flight attendant straightened. "Miss, I cannot let you. I'm a trained fighter pilot." The sentence was simple, direct, no drama. For a brief moment, the noise of the cabin seemed to drop away. The flight attendant stared at her, disbelief flashing openly across her face. "I'm sorry, I'm a trained fighter pilot," the girl repeated. "I've flown in conditions worse than this. Something is wrong with your aircraft, and the cockpit needs to know what I'm observing." A ripple of reaction moved through the surrounding rows. Someone laughed, short, sharp, nervous. "This is not the time for jokes." Another passenger shook their head. "Sit down before you get someone hurt." The flight attendant glanced around, clearly aware of the attention now fixed on them. Her training told her to de-escalate, to return control to procedure, but something about the girl's presence made that difficult. "What exactly are you saying?" the attendant asked, lowering her voice. The plane dipped again, violently this time. The floor seemed to drop out from under them before slamming back into place. A wave of screams surged through the cabin. The girl didn't lose her balance. "That drop wasn't weather," she said calmly. "It was a delayed correction. The engines are compensating unevenly and the pitch response is lagging. You're either dealing with a control surface issue or compromised instrumentation." The flight attendant froze. Those were not the words of a frightened passenger. Those were the words of someone who understood aircraft behavior. The attendant swallowed. "How would you know that?" "Because I've trained for it," the girl replied. "Because I've handled it at speeds and altitudes that don't allow for mistakes. And because your captain's last announcement wasn't just nervous, it was incomplete." Another jolt hit mid-sentence, but she continued without missing a beat. "Something isn't responding the way it should. If the cockpit is overloaded right now, they need another set of experienced eyes." The flight attendant felt the shift, not just in the girl, but in herself. Doubt gave way to urgency. Still, procedure mattered. "I can't just take a passenger to the cockpit," she said, though her voice lacked conviction now. "You don't have time for procedure," the girl replied quietly. "You have time for decisions." The words struck harder than shouting ever could. A second flight attendant approached, her expression tense. "What's going on?" The first attendant spoke quickly. "She says she's a fighter pilot." The second attendant looked at the girl, skepticism written plainly across her face. "Ma'am, that's a very serious claim." "I know," the girl said, "and I wouldn't make it unless it mattered." "Do you have identification?" the second attendant asked. "In my bag," the girl replied, "but by the time you check it, this situation could escalate." As if summoned by her words, the aircraft shuddered violently again. Longer this time, deeper. The lights flickered once more. A loud metallic groan echoed through the cabin, and several passengers cried out in pure terror. That sound changed everything. The flight attendants exchanged a glance, one that carried fear, calculation, and responsibility all at once. The first attendant pressed the intercom button on the phone clipped to her uniform. "Cockpit," she said urgently. "We have a passenger claiming to be a trained fighter pilot. She's demonstrating significant aviation knowledge." Static crackled. The response from the cockpit was tense, rushed, barely audible over the noise of turbulence. "Repeat," the voice said. The attendant relayed the information quickly, her words tumbling over each other. "She's identified possible control or instrumentation issues. She's calm, she's confident, she's requesting to assist." A long pause followed. The cabin held its breath. Another jolt hit harder than any before. A woman screamed uncontrollably. Someone shouted, "We're going down." Then the intercom crackled again. "Bring her forward," the voice said. The attendant's heart pounded. She looked at the girl. "If this is not true, it is," the girl said simply. The attendants moved quickly now. One gestured for the girl to follow, while the other turned to face the passengers. "Everyone, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened," she announced, her voice firm but shaking. "We are addressing the situation." As the girl moved down the aisle, hands reached out instinctively, grabbing armrests, gripping seatbacks, clinging to strangers. Some passengers stared at her with disbelief, others with desperate hope. A man whispered, "Is she really a pilot?" Another murmured, "Please let her be." She walked steadily, adjusting her steps with each tremor of the plane. Her breathing remained slow, controlled. Fear existed, but it was contained, compartmentalized, secondary to focus. At the cockpit door, the lead flight attendant paused and knocked sharply. The aircraft shook again. The door opened. Inside, chaos waited, but the girl didn't hesitate. She stepped forward. Within moments, the passenger from seat 12A was no longer just part of the cabin. She was being escorted into the heart of the aircraft, where decisions would determine whether everyone behind her would see the ground safely again. And the door closed. Inside, the cockpit was alive with noise, not the steady, controlled hum of a normal flight deck, but a sharp, relentless barrage of alarms, warning tones cutting through the air like blades. Red lights flashed across the instrument panels in urgent patterns, each one demanding attention, each one signaling a system under stress. The glow reflected off the glass displays, painting the cockpit in flashes of crimson and amber. The smell of heated electronics hung faintly in the air. The moment she stepped inside, the door sealing shut behind her, the world of passengers disappeared. There were no screams here, no gasps, only the language of machines struggling to stay airborne. The aircraft lurched violently, throwing her slightly forward. She caught herself instinctively, gripping the side of a seat, her body adjusting to the motion without conscious thought. Years of training had wired those responses deep into muscle memory. The captain's hands were tight on the controls, knuckles pale. Sweat beaded along his hairline despite the cool cockpit air. The first officer was rapidly scanning checklists, fingers shaking just enough to betray the pressure they were under. "Autopilot's unstable," the first officer said sharply. "We're getting conflicting data." Another alarm blared, louder this time. "Terrain warning," the system announced mechanically. The words echoed heavier than any scream. She didn't speak immediately. She watched. Her eyes moved across the instrument panel in precise patterns. taking in airspeed, altitude, pitch, engine output, control surface indicators. She listened not just to the alarms, but to the rhythm of them, which were repeating, which were escalating, which were secondary reactions rather than root causes. Outside the cockpit windows, the sky was a wall of gray chaos. Thick storm clouds slammed against the aircraft, rain streaking violently across the glass. Visibility was almost non-existent. There was no horizon, only motion and force. We've lost consistent attitude reference, the captain said, voice strained. Instruments are lagging. The plane dropped suddenly, a sharp dip that made the cockpit feel weightless for a terrifying second. The controls resisted, then overcorrected. The aircraft shuddered in protest. Control was slipping away. She stepped forward. May I? She asked not as a challenge, but as a statement of readiness. The captain hesitated for half a second. In aviation, half a second could mean everything. Another alarm screamed, "Take it," he said. She slid into position smoothly, hands settling on the controls with a familiarity that felt almost unnatural in a civilian cockpit. The layout was different from what she was used to, larger, heavier, slower to respond, but the principles were the same. Lift, thrust, balance, control. Her grip was firm but relaxed. The first thing she did was silence nothing. Alarms were information. Panic came from ignoring them, not hearing them. Confirm airspeed manually, she said calmly. Cross-check with angle of attack, not just digital readouts. The first officer blinked, then nodded, moving instantly. Airspeed inconsistent, but angle supports controlled flight. Good, she said. We're flying. The plane wants to stay in the air. We just need to stop fighting it. The weather hit again harder. A violent downdraft slammed the aircraft, forcing the nose down abruptly. The cockpit shook, panels vibrating, warning lights flaring brighter. Passengers screamed somewhere behind the sealed door. She compensated smoothly, easing pressure instead of yanking the controls. Her movements were deliberate, measured, no wasted motion, no hesitation, reduce control inputs, she said. The system's overreacting, let the aircraft settle. The captain watched, stunned not by what she said, but by how she said it. There was no fear in her voice, no rush, only clarity. Years of intense training flooded back, not as memories, but as instinct. High-speed dives, zero. Visibility approaches. Emergency failures drilled until reaction replaced thought. Situations where mistakes meant no second chances. This was slower, heavier, but no less dangerous. The instruments continued flashing red hydraulics warnings, sensor discrepancies, turbulence alerts stacking atop one another. The noise was overwhelming, but she filtered it out, focusing on what mattered most. What's primary? She asked. Flight control response, the captain said, and weather avoidance. Then we stabilize first, she replied. Weather comes second. The plane bucked again, but less violently this time. She adjusted trim carefully, feeling the response through the controls. The aircraft resisted, then gradually complied. The pitch stabilized just enough to breathe. Engines are holding, the first officer reported. No flameout, powers uneven but stable. Good, she said. Then we work with what we have. Outside, lightning flashed through the clouds, briefly illuminating the cockpit in harsh white light. For a split second, the rain-streaked glass showed nothing but chaos beyond it. Inside, she created order. Disengage autopilot fully, she instructed, already disengaged. The captain replied, Good, keep it off, manual only. Another alarm blared, then fell silent as the first officer acknowledged it. The plane rolled slightly to the left, then corrected. Her hands stayed calm, that was the difference. Fear made people overcorrect. Panic made them fight the aircraft. She didn't fight it, she listened to it. Vertical speed stabilizing, the first officer said, surprise creeping into his voice. Because we stopped forcing it, she replied. The aircraft was still in danger, still surrounded by brutal weather, still dealing with compromised systems. But it was no longer spiraling toward disaster. Seconds stretched long, sweat ran down her spine unnoticed. Another pocket of turbulence slammed them hard, but she anticipated it this time, adjusting just before impact. The plane shook violently, but held. That was a microburst, she said. We ride it out, no aggressive inputs. The captain exhaled shakily. You've done this before. Yes, she said simply. The instruments continued flashing, but now they made sense. Patterns emerged, warnings became manageable instead of overwhelming. Visibility's still trash. The first officer said, "We're blind out there. We don't need to see yet," she replied. "We just need control." Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the chaos softened. The aircraft's movements became less erratic. The alarms, while still present, stopped stacking uncontrollably. Control was returning. She guided the aircraft through the storm not with force, but with patience. Every correction was small, every decision deliberate. She trusted physics, training, and timing. Minutes passed like hours. "Then there," she said quietly. "What?" the captain asked. "The worst of it," she replied. "We're through the core." The turbulence didn't vanish, but it weakened. The aircraft still shook, but no longer felt like it was being torn apart. She kept flying, calm hands. Sharp decisions, precision carved out of chaos, and for the first time since the alarms began, the cockpit wasn't reacting anymore. It was flying. Then, at last, the runway lights broke through the clouds. At first, they were barely more than faint dots small, trembling pinpoints of white and gold piercing the endless gray. They flickered uncertainly through sheets of rain, appearing and disappearing as the aircraft pushed forward. For a moment, no one in the cockpit spoke. No one dared to name what they were seeing, as if saying it aloud might cause it to vanish. Then the lights grew clearer, stronger, aligned there. She said quietly. The word carried more weight than any command she had given before. The captain leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he focused through the cockpit glass. The first officer's breath caught audibly. After endless minutes of flying blind through chaos, the world had finally returned, not fully, not gently. "But enough, we have the runway," the captain said, his voice thick with disbelief and relief. Outside, the storm still raged, but it no longer owned them. The clouds thinned just enough to reveal the approach lights stretching forward like a path pulled from darkness. Rain lashed the windshield, wind clawed at the fuselage, and turbulence still shoved the aircraft from side to side. But now there was direction. Purpose, a way down. She adjusted her grip slightly, easing the aircraft into alignment. Her movements were precise, economical. There was no drama in her hands, only control. The plane responded slowly, heavily, but it responded. "Approach is unstable," the first officer warned, wind shear still active. "I know," she replied. "We'll ride it." The runway grew larger with every second, rushing toward them through the haze. The aircraft shuddered as another gust slammed into its side, pushing it off centerline. She corrected smoothly, anticipating the resistance rather than reacting to it. "Don't chase it," she murmured, half to herself, half to the plane. The altimeter ticked down relentlessly. 500 feet, 400. The warning alarms tried to return, flashing and chirping insistently, but they were no longer in control of the moment. She silenced what needed silencing, focused only on what mattered now: speed, descent, alignment. Behind the cockpit door, the cabin was frozen in collective terror. Passengers clutched armrests and strangers' hands. Some had their eyes squeezed shut, whispering prayers through trembling lips. Others stared forward, breath held, waiting for either impact or miracle. Tears streamed silently down faces that had already accepted too much fear for one lifetime. No one spoke, no one screamed, everyone waited. Back in the cockpit, the runway lights filled the windshield now, bright and unwavering. The storm tried once more to shove them aside, but she held the aircraft steady, riding the edge between force and finesse. "Minimums," the first officer announced. "I have it," she said. 200 feet, 100. The ground rushed up faster than it should have. The landing would not be smooth. There was no fixing that now. The goal was no longer elegance. It was survival. She flared late, intentionally choosing control over comfort. The wheels hit the runway hard. The impact thundered through the aircraft like an explosion. Metal screamed, tires shrieked against wet concrete, and the entire plane jolted violently forward. Overhead bins rattled, passengers were thrown against their seatbelts, and cries ripped through the cabin. Then the second set of wheels slammed down. The aircraft bounced once dangerously, but she corrected instantly, forcing it back onto the runway, holding it there with everything she had. "Speed!" the captain shouted, deploying. She replied. Reverse thrust roared, engines screaming as the plane decelerated aggressively. The runway lights streaked past on either side, rain blurring them into endless lines of white. The plane fishtailed slightly, wind fighting to push it off course. She didn't let it. Her hands were steady, unyielding. The aircraft slowed, 70 knots, 60, 50. The roar faded to a rumble, finally mercifully. The plane rolled to a controlled stop. Silence followed. Not immediately. First came the ticking of cooling metal, the low whine of systems winding down, the sound of rain drumming against the fuselage, the hum of electricity flowing where it should, then silence. For a single heartbeat no one moved. No one spoke. The world seemed to pause, as if waiting for permission to continue. Then the cabin exploded. Applause erupted from every row, loud and uncontrolled. Hands slammed together, some shaking, some desperate. People sobbed openly now, tears of relief streaming freely down faces that moments ago had been frozen in fear. Laughter broke out, hysterical, breathless, unstoppable. Someone shouted, "We're alive." Another voice cried, "Thank you, thank you." Flight attendants dropped into empty seats, covering their faces as emotion overwhelmed them. Strangers hugged without hesitation. A child laughed through tears, confused but joyful, sensing the shift from terror to safety. In the cockpit, the captain leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, chest rising and falling heavily. The first officer wiped his face with the back of his hand, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I can't believe we're on the ground." She finally released the controls. Only then did the weight of what had happened settle fully onto her shoulders. Her hands trembled for the first time, not from fear, but from the sudden absence of it. Adrenaline drained away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. She took a slow breath, then another. The captain turned to her, unable to find words at first. You saved us," he said finally. She shook her head gently. "We flew it together." But he knew. They all did. The cockpit door opened, and the sound from the cabin rushed in. Applause, cries, voices overlapping in gratitude and disbelief. A flight attendant stood there, tears streaking her face, one hand pressed to her mouth. "They want to see you," she said. "They need to." She hesitated. She had boarded this flight wanting nothing more than to arrive unnoticed. Just another passenger, just seat 12A, but some moments didn't allow anonymity. When she stepped into the aisle, the reaction was immediate. Applause surged louder, rolling toward her like a wave. People stood despite instructions, clapping, crying, reaching out as she passed. A woman grabbed her hand, sobbing, "You brought us home." A man nodded through tears, "I'll never forget this." She didn't know what to say. So she didn't say anything. She simply walked back to her seat, seat 12A, slowly, quietly, surrounded by gratitude and disbelief. When she reached it, she paused, resting her hand on the headrest, looking around at the faces she had helped carry safely back to the ground. Moments ago, they had been strangers suspended in fear. Now they were survivors, the engines powered down completely. Emergency crews surrounded the aircraft outside, lights flashing red and blue through rain, soaked windows. But inside there was calm now, deep, earned as the cabin settled. Applause softened into murmurs, then into quiet reflection. People wiped their faces, steadied their breathing, held onto the simple miracle of standing still on solid ground. She sat down in seat 12A once more. Same seat, same girl, but nothing else was the same. She had boarded as a passenger. She landed as a hero, not because she sought it, not because she announced it, but because when the sky turned unforgiving, courage rose quietly, steadily from the most unexpected seat.